The pin that held back a division. At 3:17 in the morning, on March 25, 1945, near a muddy crossing site east of the Rhine, a British sapper from the Royal Engineers was on his knees beside a half-built Bailey bridge, trying to force a steel panel pin through two misaligned holes. The river was black in the darkness. Behind him, tank engines idled in a long, nervous line. Their exhaust drifted low across the road and mixed with the smell of wet earth, oil, cordite, and river mud. Somewhere further back, a driver coughed into his sleeve. A tank commander leaned out of his turret and looked toward the water, then back at his watch. The minute hand moved slowly. Too slowly. The bridge was almost finished. Almost. That word could kill men. The sapper's hands were stiff from cold. His gloves were soaked through. Every time he tried to push the pin into place, the bridge panel shifted just enough to resist him. The steel holes were close enough to see daylight through them, but not close enough for the pin to slide home. He could hear men breathing around him. He could hear boots slipping on wet planks. He could hear the short, ugly clank of tools against metal. Then, from the far bank, came the first shell. It did not land on the bridge. Not yet. It landed somewhere upstream, behind a ruined line of trees, and the explosion rolled across the water with a dull pressure that could be felt in the ribs. Dirt fell from the bank. One of the men beside him flinched. Another swore under his breath and kept holding the panel steady. The sapper did not look up. The tanks behind him were not waiting for courage. They were waiting for alignment. They were waiting for geometry. They were waiting for one small piece of steel. A Bailey Bridge panel pin was not dramatic. It was not famous. It did not have the silhouette of a Sherman tank or the roar of a Typhoon fighter bomber. It was small enough for a man to carry in one hand. In daylight, laid on a table, it could look almost ordinary. But in that moment, on that riverbank, the pin had become the narrow point through which an entire armored advance had to pass. The men behind the bridge believed in momentum. They had been told to keep moving. Cross the river. Exploit the breach. Push before the German defense could reset. Armor was speed. Armor was pressure. Armor was the thing that turned a cracked enemy line into a collapse. But what really happened on European battlefields was often quieter, slower, and more humiliating. A tank could not argue with a river. A battalion could not drive across a gap because a map arrow said it should. A commander could demand speed, but a bridge had to obey load, weight, angle, current, mud, and steel. The sapper pulled the pin back out. He wiped mud from the end with the heel of his glove. A corporal beside him jammed a pry bar between the panels and leaned his weight into it. Another man lifted a hammer. Nobody made a speech. There was no room for one. Again, someone said. The holes shifted. The sapper pushed. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the pin moved half an inch. The men froze, almost afraid to disturb it. Another shell landed closer. A flare rose beyond the river, pale and trembling, turning the mud silver and the steel white. For a moment, the whole crossing site seemed exposed, the panels, the men, the waiting tanks, the trucks beyond them, the river itself. The hammer came down. Once. Twice. The pin slid through. Not cleanly. Not easily. But enough. And behind the sapper, the armored column continued to wait, because one pin was not the bridge. It was only one answer in a night full of problems. The question was no longer whether the Allies had tanks. The question was whether they could get them across before the enemy understood where to aim. And to understand why that tiny piece of steel mattered so much, we have to leave the riverbank for a moment and step into the minds of the men who thought armored war was moved by something much larger. What generals thought moved armies. To a commander looking at a map, an armored advance had a certain beauty. Arrows moved forward. Lines bent. Enemy positions were circled in pencil and crossed out. A river appeared as a blue mark, a road as a thin line, a village as a name. There was order in it, or at least the illusion of order. In briefing rooms, armored warfare sounded almost mechanical. Tanks would break through. Infantry would secure the flanks. Artillery would suppress resistance. Fighter bombers would strike road junctions and gun positions. Trucks would bring fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, and replacements. The whole machine would keep moving because movement itself was the weapon. That belief was not foolish. By 1944 and 1945, the Allies had learned the power of movement. Once the front cracked, speed could become a form of violence. A German unit that had time to dig in was one problem. A German unit caught moving, low on fuel, cut off from orders, and struck from the air was another. The tank seemed to embody that lesson. The Sherman did not need to be perfect to be useful. It could be built in huge numbers, maintained in the field, and pushed across Europe with a supply system behind it. British Churchills could climb ground that punished lighter vehicles. Cromwells could move quickly on roads. Tank destroyers, half-tracks, armored cars, recovery vehicles, all of them gave the front a sense of weight and direction. From the German side, the visible threat was also armor. Anti-tank guns were sighted along likely approaches. Mines were buried in roads and field entrances. Panzerfaust teams waited in villages, behind shattered walls, inside barns, at corners where a tank's turret could not turn quickly enough. A single well-placed gun could force a column to halt. A destroyed lead vehicle could block a narrow road and turn the vehicles behind it into targets. So both sides watched the tanks. Both sides measured them. Both sides feared them. But tanks were only the visible part of the advance. Behind every armored spearhead was a long, fragile chain: fuel bozers, ammunition lorries, mechanics, cooks, medics, military police, signalers, recovery crews, spare engines, maps, bridge stores, and men who knew how to repair what war broke faster than planners could replace it. The further the tanks moved, the more that chain stretched. A commander could order a brigade forward at dawn. But if a bridge was gone, the order stopped at the riverbank. If the wrong bridge parts were still 20 miles back, stuck behind a traffic jam, the advance stopped there too. If a panel pin was lost in mud, bent during unloading, or sitting in a crate on the wrong truck, then the great machine became suddenly small. That was the hidden weakness of mobile war. Movement depended on fixed points. Roads. Crossings. Culverts. Bridges. A tank could smash through a wall. It could crush a fence. It could grind across a field if the ground was firm enough. But in front of a canal, a river, or a demolished span, it became strangely helpless. The crew could sit inside all that armor, surrounded by steel and ammunition, and still be unable to move 10 yards forward. German commanders knew this. They had learned, through years of retreat and counterattack, that time could be manufactured by destruction. Blow a bridge, crater a road, flood a low field, drop trees across a route, and the enemy's speed became congestion. A river did not have to stop the Allies forever. It only had to stop them long enough. Long enough for artillery to register. Long enough for reserves to arrive. Long enough for a broken defense to breathe again. This was what the Allies had to defeat. Not just German divisions. Not just gun lines. Not just the remnants of the Wehrmacht holding village after village. They had to defeat delay. And delay often began with a gap in the road. On the map, the solution looked simple: bring up the engineers. But on the road to the front, nothing was simple. Bridge trucks had to fight for space with fuel columns, ambulances, ammunition vehicles, and tanks needing repair. Roads were narrow. Villages were smashed. Drivers took wrong turns in darkness. Military police shouted themselves hoarse at crossroads where 3 units all believed they had priority. And somewhere ahead, the river waited. Not with anger. Not with intention. Just with water, depth, current, and empty space. The belief had been that armored warfare was decided by the machines that crossed the battlefield. What really happened was that those machines often depended on men who reached the obstacle first, got out into the mud, and made a road where no road remained. But before those men could do that, they had to confront the old enemy of every army in Europe, the river. The river problem no tank could solve. A river does not need to be wide to change a battle. It only needs to be deep enough, fast enough, or steep-banked enough to make a driver hesitate. Across Europe, the Allied advance met water everywhere. Great rivers, small rivers, canals, drainage ditches, flooded meadows, broken culverts, irrigation channels, and streams that became traps after rain. Some appeared clearly on maps. Others did not. Some looked harmless until the first vehicle sank to its axles. Some were narrow enough for a man to throw a stone across, but too dangerous for a tank to risk. To infantry, water could be crossed badly if it had to be. Men could wade, swim, use assault boats, cling to ropes, stumble through mud with rifles held above their heads. They might lose equipment. They might drown. They might arrive exhausted and half-frozen. But men could sometimes cross where machines could not. Tanks were different. They needed weight-bearing ground. They needed ramps. They needed approaches that would not collapse under their tracks. They needed a bridge not simply to exist, but to be strong enough for repeated crossings by vehicles that might weigh 30 tons or more. And the Germans understood something essential: a destroyed bridge was not merely an absence. It was a weapon. As German forces withdrew, demolition parties wired bridges with charges, blew spans into rivers, dropped masonry into channels, and left behind twisted metal that blocked the very places where the Allies most needed speed. Sometimes the explosions came just minutes before Allied troops arrived. Sometimes the bridge was still smoking when the first patrol reached it. Sometimes the road simply ended in broken stone and water. For the tank crews, the feeling was bitter. They had pushed through shellfire, mines, villages, hedgerows, roadblocks. They had lost men to guns they never saw. They had watched friends burn in vehicles that only hours earlier had felt solid and safe. Then, after all of that, they reached a river, and stopped. No enemy tank in sight. No duel. No heroic charge. Just water. Behind them, the road began to fill. One tank stopped, then another. A recovery vehicle pulled to the side. A fuel truck tried to pass and found no room. An ambulance waited with wounded men inside. Infantry climbed down and smoked in silence because there was nothing else to do. Officers moved forward on foot, stepping around mudholes, asking the same question in different tones. How long? The answer depended on things that never appeared in battlefield legends. How far back were the bridge stores? Was the bank suitable? Had reconnaissance measured the span correctly? Could the approach road hold traffic? Was the enemy observing the site? Were the panels damaged? Were the pins present? The Bailey Bridge became one of the Allied answers to this problem. But no bridge, however clever, could abolish friction. A Bailey Bridge did not float magically into place. It had to be carried, assembled, launched, checked, and trusted. The Germans believed destroyed bridges could buy them time. They were right. But what they did not fully grasp, especially as the Allies grew more practiced, was the speed with which engineers could sometimes erase that advantage. A demolished crossing that should have halted armor for days might be reopened in hours. A gap that looked permanent could become a road before dawn. That was the nightmare for a defender. Not that the Allies had bridges. But that they had bridges in pieces. Pieces that could be moved by truck. Lifted by men. Locked together with pins. Repeated again and again across the broken geography of war. Still, every solution created a new dependency. A Bailey Bridge was modular. That was its genius. But modular meant that every part mattered. Panels, transoms, stringers, decking, ramps, rollers, launching nose, pins. Especially pins. A bridge panel without its pin was not part of a bridge. It was steel waiting for purpose. Enough missing pieces, and the entire crossing plan could become a pile of metal on the bank while the enemy's guns adjusted. The river did not care about strategy. It did not care that a corps commander wanted the advance resumed by morning. It did not care that a tank regiment had fuel, ammunition, and orders. The river only answered to contact, weight, balance, and time. And the men sent to solve it were rarely the ones who appeared in victory photographs. They were the engineers, tired, practical, often overlooked, who saw the battlefield not as a line of glory, but as a long list of broken things that had to be made usable again. The men behind the advance. The combat engineers' war was made of interruptions. A road crater. A minefield. A blown culvert. A bridge gone. A tree across a lane. A tank bellied in mud. A truck burning at a crossroads. A wire obstacle no infantryman wanted to touch. A riverbank too soft for wheels. A map that promised a road where shellfire had left only broken stone. They were called forward when movement failed. And movement failed constantly. The men of the Royal Engineers, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Canadian Engineers, and other Allied engineer units lived close to the place where planning met mud. They were not usually described with the same language used for fighter pilots or tank commanders. Their work was practical. Dirty. Often repetitive. They lifted, dug, measured, carried, cut, hammered, cleared, filled, and rebuilt. Yet their decisions could decide whether an attack continued or died in place. An engineer at a river crossing had to think in layers. The infantry saw the far bank. The tank crew saw the ramp. The commander saw the objective beyond the river. The engineer had to see everything in between, the gradient of the approach, the firmness of the bank, the current, the span, the load class, the traffic flow, the turning space, the enemy observation points, the location of bridge stores, the order of assembly, and the men available to do the work. All of that while tired. Always tired. Men who built bridges under combat conditions rarely arrived fresh. They came after days of movement, after nights without real sleep, after hours spent clearing mines or repairing roads. Their hands were cut from metal edges. Their shoulders bruised from carrying panels. Their uniforms stank of river water, grease, and smoke. A Bailey panel was not light. Several men were needed to handle one safely. Under fire, safety became a negotiation. A man lifted before he was ready because the others had already lifted. Someone slipped. Someone's fingers were almost crushed. Someone shouted, not from anger, but because noise was the only way to be heard over engines and artillery. And still, there was calculation. This is what made engineers different. They worked with fear, but they could not surrender to it. A frightened infantryman might fire too soon. A frightened tank commander might reverse out of a bad lane. A frightened engineer could not simply hammer faster and hope the bridge held. If the structure was wrong, fear would become collapse. That made their courage quiet. They did not always run toward the enemy in the way people imagine courage. Sometimes they stayed standing in one place while the enemy's guns searched for them. Sometimes they returned to a bridge after a shell burst because a half-built crossing was worse than no crossing at all. Sometimes they told impatient officers that no tank would cross yet, because the bridge was not ready, and saying that took its own kind of nerve. The underdog in this story is not one man alone. It is a type of soldier. The man with a measuring tape while others held rifles. The man carrying steel while others moved behind armor. The sergeant who knew that a missing pin could matter more than a shouted order. The corporal who saw, by touch in the dark, that two holes were not aligned and that forcing the wrong connection might kill the first tank crew to cross. They were not always celebrated because their success often looked like nothing. If they did their job well, the tank rolled over the bridge, the column moved, and the map arrow continued. The moment passed into a report as a completed crossing. The bridge itself became background. But the men knew. They knew how many times the work had almost failed. They knew how many pieces had to be present. They knew how quickly the enemy would notice a crossing site. They knew that every minute of delay seemed to thicken the air. And they knew the strange humiliation of being essential only when everything else had stopped. The belief among many fighting men was that engineers were support. What really happened was that support sometimes became the spearhead. Before the tanks could advance, before the infantry could exploit, before the commanders could claim momentum, somebody had to put steel across the water. And the bridge they carried forward looked, at first glance, almost too simple for the job. The bridge that looked too simple to matter. The Bailey Bridge did not look like a secret weapon. It had no turret. No armor plate. No engine. No gun. It was a system of steel panels, cross beams, decking, ramps, rollers, and pins. In pieces, it looked like construction material. Stacked on trucks, it could seem dull beside the machines of war. But its dullness was part of its power. The bridge had been designed with a battlefield truth in mind. Heavy equipment was often unavailable exactly where it was needed, but men were there. Trucks were there. Tools were there. So the bridge had to be strong, modular, and simple enough to assemble near the front. That idea carried a kind of quiet brilliance. Instead of waiting for a permanent bridge, engineers could build a temporary one from prefabricated parts. Instead of relying on specialized machinery for every step, trained soldiers could lift and connect panels by hand. Instead of designing a bridge for one place, the system could be adapted to many gaps, many loads, many emergencies. Its basic side panels formed trusses. Transoms ran across them. Decking created the roadway. Additional panels could be added for strength. A launching nose could help push the bridge across a gap from one bank to the other. Rollers helped the structure move. Pins locked the panels together. And there, in that last sentence, the story narrows. Pins locked the panels together. A Bailey panel pin was not glamorous. It was a connector. But a modular bridge lives or dies by connection. The panels carried strength only when joined correctly. The design depended on repeated, reliable contact, steel hole to steel hole, pin through both, load transferred through the assembled structure. Without that connection, the bridge was not a bridge. It was intention. This is where the tiny bridge part becomes more than a detail. It becomes the symbol of the entire system. Industrial war often appears massive from a distance: fleets, armies, factories, convoys, bomber streams. But those vast systems depend on small standardized objects arriving in the right place at the right time. A missing bolt can ground an aircraft. A broken track link can stop a tank. A lost firing pin can silence a weapon. A missing bridge pin can hold back an armored column. The Bailey Bridge was praised because it accepted this truth and used it. It turned war's need for improvisation into a kit of repeatable parts. It did not ask every crossing to be invented from nothing. It gave exhausted men a system. But a system is only as strong as its weakest moment under pressure. On a training ground, a panel pin could be inserted cleanly. Men could learn the order of assembly. Officers could check the work. Mistakes could be corrected without shells landing nearby. The front was different. At the front, trucks arrived late. Parts were unloaded in darkness. Mud swallowed tools. Panels were bent by rough handling. Men worked under blackout conditions or under the false daylight of flares. A pin dropped into deep mud could disappear as completely as if the earth had eaten it. A hammer blow could glance off steel and crush a finger. A man could be killed carrying a component that another man then had to step over and lift. The bridge's simplicity did not remove danger. It made action possible inside danger. That was the difference. Some officers may have underestimated the importance of such engineering because it lacked drama. But the men who had seen a column halted at water understood. A bridge did not need to be famous to be decisive. It only needed to be there before the enemy's delay became a defense. What they believed was that the great tools of war were the ones that looked powerful. What really happened was that power often depended on small, plain objects made to fit exactly, used by men who had no time to admire them. But the final proof of any battlefield invention never comes in drawings. It comes when the first shell lands close, and the men keep building. Assembly under fire. A Bailey Bridge was not simply built. It was assembled against resistance. First came the bank. Engineers had to find ground that could take the load and approaches that vehicles could actually use. A bridge that reached the far side was useless if the first tank bogged down before touching it. Men checked the soil, the slope, the width of the gap, the line of approach. Sometimes they did this while crouched under fire. Sometimes they did it at night, with only shaded lamps and shouted measurements. Then came the unloading. Panels came off trucks with the sound of steel striking steel. Men formed teams and lifted together. Boots slid. Shoulders took the weight. Somebody counted components. Somebody else cursed because a truck was missing, or because the wrong load had arrived first, or because a crate had been put down in the dark where no one could find it again. The panels were brought forward and pinned together. Transoms were lifted into place. Stringers and decking followed. Rollers were set beneath the structure so the bridge could be pushed forward. If the gap required it, a lighter launching nose was assembled at the front, reaching out first across the empty space so the main bridge could follow without tipping into the river. On paper, the sequence had order. On the bank, order had to be defended. A shell burst could scatter a carrying party. A flare could freeze every man in place. A wounded engineer might be dragged back while another stepped into his position without waiting to be told. A radio set crackled with questions from headquarters that sounded absurd to the men doing the work. How long until completion? How many minutes? Can armor cross by first light? The answers were never clean. Because the bridge was a living problem. Every connection affected the next. If one panel sat badly, the pin might refuse to enter. If the pin did not enter, the assembly slowed. If the assembly slowed, the vehicles waited. If the vehicles waited, the enemy had more time. The men worked in a strange mixture of urgency and restraint. Hurry, but do not misbuild. Force the pin, but do not damage the hole. Push the bridge, but do not lose alignment. Open the route, but do not kill the first crew by pretending the bridge is ready before it is. There is a particular sound to metal refusing to fit. It is not loud like a gun. It is small, stubborn, intimate. A pin striking the edge of a hole. A hammer blow that does nothing. A pry bar scraping. Men breathing harder than the weight alone requires. That sound could be more frightening than artillery because it meant time was passing without progress. Imagine the scene again, men hunched around a joint in the bridge, trying to line up the panels. One holds a lamp low, shielding it with his body. Another drives the pry bar into the gap and leans until his back shakes. The sapper with the pin waits, watching the holes. The hammer is ready. Behind them, tank engines cough and settle into idle. Crews sit inside steel holes, listening. They cannot see much. They only know that they are not moving. On the far side, German observers may already be searching the river. A bridge site has a signature, vehicles gathering, men moving, sudden bursts of noise, the shape of activity near water. Once found, it can be shelled. That knowledge presses on every man at the site. Work faster. Work correctly. Work while afraid. The belief behind the Bailey Bridge was that trained men could build a strong crossing quickly from standardized parts. What really happened under fire was messier. The bridge did not assemble itself because the design was clever. It became real because men kept returning to the steel after every interruption. And then, in the final stretch, when the crossing looked almost ready, the whole effort could still narrow to one last connection. One pin. One decision. One question no one wanted to answer too soon. Would the first tank cross? When the advance stopped cold. The first tank at a new bridge crossing always carried more than its own weight. It carried the doubts of every man watching. The driver could feel the ramp through the tracks. The commander could see the bridge ahead, narrow and exposed, stretching across water that looked darker than the sky. The crew might trust the engineers. They might trust orders. But trust does not make steel silent. A temporary bridge speaks when weight comes onto it. It creaks. It settles. It flexes. And when the bridge is not yet cleared, the tank does not move. That is when an armored advance becomes something almost unbearable, a line of machines built for motion, forced into stillness. At the head of the column, men wait. Behind them, more men wait. Drivers keep engines running because stopping and restarting can create its own problems. Fuel burns for no gain. Exhaust thickens along the road. Infantrymen shift their weight and listen for incoming shells. Military police try to keep the route open, but vehicles continue to gather because the road behind the front does not understand that the front has stopped. A delay at the bridge is never local. It travels backward. A tank cannot cross, so the vehicles behind cannot cross. If the tanks cannot cross, the infantry on the far side may not get armored support. If the support cannot cross, the enemy has time to strengthen the far bank. If the crossing site is observed, artillery will come. If artillery comes, engineers may be killed, parts damaged, trucks destroyed, approaches cratered. All because a bridge is not ready. The old image of armored warfare breaks down here. There is no charge. No sweeping maneuver. No commander standing above the chaos with perfect knowledge. There is only a hard choice. Wait until the engineers are certain. Or push too soon. Neither choice is safe. An impatient officer might see only the delay. He might look at the tanks, then at the bridge, and think, it is close enough. War does not reward hesitation. The enemy is retreating. Move now. The engineer sees something else. He sees load paths. He sees a joint that was difficult to close. He sees a bank softened by rain. He sees decking not yet fully secured. He sees what happens if the lead tank reaches the center and the bridge fails, not just the death of that crew, but the blocking of the crossing, the wreckage in the gap, the panic in every driver ordered to follow. So he says no. Not forever. But for now. That word can feel like betrayal to men trained to attack. No. Not yet. The Germans, meanwhile, do not need to know the details. They only need to sense the delay. Artillery begins to search. The first rounds may fall wide. Then closer. A shell lands on the road behind the column, and drivers duck inside their cabs. Another lands near the bank, throwing water and mud over the men working at the bridge. A fragment strikes metal with a sharp sound like a hammer on an anvil. The bridge crew pauses. Only for a second. Then they go back. This is the reversal at the heart of the story. The tanks were supposed to create momentum. But at the river, they became dependent on men without armor. The enemy's destroyed bridge was supposed to halt the Allies. But the Bailey Bridge threatened to undo that delay. Yet the Bailey itself depended on small parts and exact work. One pin, one misalignment, one missing component could give the defender back the time he had tried to create with explosives. What they believed was that the armored column would carry the attack forward. What really happened was that the column could be stopped cold by the smallest failure in the route beneath it. And once the column stopped, time began to count differently. Not in hours on a staff schedule. In engines idling. In shells walking closer. In wounded men waiting for the road to open. In the strange mathematics of survival. The mathematics of a missing part. A bridge delay is easy to misunderstand from a distance. 10 minutes sounds small. 30 minutes sounds inconvenient. 2 hours sounds serious, but not always decisive. On a battlefield, those numbers change shape. A single bridge is a funnel. Everything that must cross has to pass through the same narrow point: tanks, half-tracks, trucks, anti-tank guns, ambulances, recovery vehicles, motorcycles, jeeps, infantry on foot, signal vehicles, fuel bozers, ammunition carriers. Even if each vehicle crosses quickly, the line grows because war does not move in neat intervals. A vehicle stalls on the ramp. A driver hesitates. An officer waves a lighter vehicle back to let armor pass. A track slips. A plank breaks loose. A medical vehicle needs priority. A tank crew is told to wait until the bridge is checked again. Every small interruption multiplies. Now imagine that the cause is a missing or damaged bridge part. A panel pin weighing only a few pounds may not seem important beside a 30-ton tank. But the pin is part of the chain that allows the tank's weight to transfer through the bridge. Without it, strength remains theoretical. War often punishes theory. The mathematics are not only structural. They are operational. If the bridge opens late, the vehicles behind it burn fuel while standing still. Crews grow tired. Infantry lose the protection of timing. Artillery schedules become less useful. Smoke screens drift away. Darkness gives way to dawn. The enemy sees more. Guns adjust more accurately. Aircraft, if present, can find the crossing. A delay that begins with steel alignment can become a casualty list. This is why engineers could not simply pretend. A badly assembled bridge could kill the first men to trust it. Temporary does not mean careless. Fast does not mean approximate. The bridge had to hold not once, but repeatedly. The first tank, the second, the 10th, the trucks after them, the recovery vehicle heavier in its own awkward way, the ambulance returning with wounded. A small failure could block the only route. And then the math becomes cruel. One tank lost on a bridge is not only one tank lost. It is a physical obstruction. It is a morale wound. It is a delay while recovery crews work under fire. It is another chance for the enemy to destroy the crossing completely. It is the transformation of a solution into a trap. That is why the engineer's caution matters. He is not slowing the war because he lacks urgency. He is slowing one moment so the next 100 vehicles can survive it. The cost comparison is almost absurd. A small steel pin, manufactured in quantity, carried in a box, handled by men whose names may never appear in a documentary title, can enable the passage of machinery worth vast sums and tactical consequences beyond calculation. But cost is not the deepest point. The deeper point is dependency. Industrial war teaches armies to worship scale. Bigger guns. More tanks. More aircraft. More divisions. More tonnage. The battlefield answers with small thresholds. A road wide enough. A bridge strong enough. A pin in place. A driver still awake. A sergeant who notices a fault before the first vehicle crosses. What matters is not only the number, but what the number reveals. 30 tons of armor can be held back by a few pounds of steel. Hundreds of men can wait on one connection. A campaign can lose tempo at the scale of an object small enough to vanish in mud. The Germans had believed that rivers and demolitions could slow the Allied advance long enough for defense to recover. They were right in principle. But the Allies had learned another principle: speed was not only movement. Speed was repair. Speed was replacement. Speed was the ability to turn destruction back into traffic before the enemy could profit from the damage. Still, every repaired crossing had a human bill. The mathematics could show weight and time. They could not show the man sent onto the bridge first. Steel, mud, and human hands. The first vehicle across a new bridge moves through a kind of silence. Even if engines are loud, even if shells are falling somewhere nearby, the men watching become quiet inside themselves. Their attention narrows. Tracks touch the ramp. The bridge takes weight. The structure settles. A plank shifts. The driver keeps moving because stopping halfway can be worse. The tank commander may stand partly exposed in the turret, not because it is safe, but because he needs to see. The driver sees less. He feels the bridge through vibration, through the slow change in resistance under the tracks. Inside the hull, the air smells of oil, metal, sweat, and old cordite. No one says much. Behind him, the engineers watch what they have built. There is pride, but it is not clean pride. It is mixed with fear. They know every difficult joint. They remember the pin that resisted, the panel that had to be forced, the place where the bank looked soft, the moment artillery landed close enough to shower the bridge with dirt. If the tank crosses, the bridge has answered. If it fails, the men who built it will carry that failure for the rest of their lives, if they live. Human cost is easy to attach to infantry assaults and tank battles. It is harder to see in engineering work because the danger looks like labor. Men lifting steel. Men cutting wire. Men placing charges. Men filling holes. Men building bridges. But bridge sites were dangerous places. They attracted fire because both sides understood their meaning. A bridge was a wound in a defensive line. Destroy it, and the enemy's movement clotted. Keep it open, and the offensive blood flowed through. Engineers could be killed before firing a shot. A man carrying a panel could be hit and drop under the weight. A shell fragment could tear through a working party. A mine missed in the approach road could destroy a truck carrying parts needed at the site. A sniper could wait for the officers and NCOs who seemed to be directing the work. And then there was exhaustion. Exhaustion is not a dramatic wound, but it makes wounds more likely. A tired man misjudges weight. A tired driver takes a turn too sharply. A tired engineer misses a crack, a loose fitting, a missing piece. Men who have not slept properly begin to move through war as if underwater, hearing commands a second late, reacting a little too slowly. Still, the work continues. One man drops into mud to recover a pin because there may not be another close enough. Another holds a lamp with shaking hands. A sergeant keeps the carrying parties moving after a shell burst because if the men scatter for too long, the bridge may never be finished before daylight. A medic waits near the road because engineers can be casualties too, though they are often remembered only as the men who made casualties easier to evacuate. Some of them are afraid. Of course they are. Fear is not the opposite of duty. It is often the condition in which duty has to be performed. A man does not have to feel heroic to do something necessary. He can be angry, cold, resentful, half sick with fatigue. He can want nothing more than to be somewhere else. Then he hears the order, sees the panel waiting, and puts his shoulder under the steel. The bridge is made from metal. But it is also made from hands. Hands cut by sharp edges. Hands black with grease. Hands numb around hammer shafts. Hands reaching for a pin in the dark. Hands that steady the structure while other men drive the connection through. What they believed, in staff language, was that engineer units would restore mobility. What really happened was that individual men absorbed the danger hidden inside that phrase. And later, when the fighting moved on, the reports would reduce all of this to a few dry words. Bridge completed. Traffic resumed. Armor crossed. The sentence would be accurate. It would also leave almost everything out. The reports that came too late. After a battle, the map becomes clean again. The arrows are redrawn. The river is crossed. The unit has advanced. The line has moved. In the report, the crossing may occupy one paragraph. Sometimes less. A time of completion. A bridge classification. A note that armor began passing at a certain hour. A mention of enemy shelling. Perhaps a casualty figure. Perhaps not. The language is necessary. Armies run on reports. Staff officers need facts, not elegies. They need to know which routes are open, which bridges can take which vehicles, where traffic is blocked, where reserves can pass. But that language can hide the truth of the work. Bridge completed may mean a night of shellfire, mud, missing parts, injured men, and decisions made with too little information. Traffic resumed may mean tank crews who had waited long enough to feel the enemy guns getting closer. Delay cleared may mean one sapper finally drove a pin into place after 20 minutes that felt longer than an hour. Recognition came unevenly. The Bailey Bridge itself became famous among those who understood mobility. Senior commanders praised the value of bridging. Engineers knew its worth. Armored units learned to respect the men who could put a road across water. German defenders, too, understood the danger. Allied bridging speed reduced the value of demolitions. A river line was no longer reliable if the enemy could bring a bridge forward in pieces and assemble it under pressure. But fame did not settle evenly on the men. The designer might be remembered. The system might be praised. The bridge might appear in photographs with tanks crossing triumphantly. Yet the individual soldiers who carried the panels and drove the pins often disappeared back into the mass of wartime service. That does not mean they were ignored by everyone. Men at the front knew. Tank crews knew who opened the route. Infantry on the far bank knew what it meant when armor finally arrived. Wounded men knew what it meant when an ambulance could cross back. But public memory has habits. It prefers the visible weapon. The tank entering the town. The aircraft overhead. The battleship firing. The general at the map. Engineering, when successful, can look like scenery. The bridge is there, so the story moves on. That is why the tiny bridge part matters as a narrative object. It forces attention back to the hidden mechanism. It reminds us that the grand movement of armies was often suspended on ordinary components, handled by ordinary men under conditions that made ordinary work dangerous. Reports later suggested, in different theaters and different operations, how crucial Bailey bridges were to Allied mobility. Verify specific after-action quotations for final production. Some commanders credited engineer bridging with restoring tempo after demolitions. Post-war accounts often noted how quickly such bridges could be assembled compared with older methods. The details vary, but the pattern is clear. Destroyed bridges were meant to create time. Bailey bridges stole that time back. Yet every stolen hour had to be earned. The Germans had believed that blowing a bridge could create a pause long enough to matter. The Allies believed that engineering could shorten that pause. What really happened depended on the men between those beliefs, men standing at the riverbank with parts in their hands, trying to turn doctrine into a crossing before the enemy turned the crossing into a grave. And the lesson did not end in 1945. Because once armies understood what modular bridging could do, the idea outlived the war that had made it famous. The bridge that changed mobility. The Bailey Bridge belonged to World War II, but its lesson was larger than World War II. It proved that mobility was not just a matter of engines. It was a matter of recovery. Repair. Standardization. Training. The ability to rebuild the ground under an army faster than the enemy could break it. That lesson traveled. Bailey bridges appeared in multiple theaters because the problem was universal. Europe had its rivers and canals. Italy had mountains, valleys, and demolished crossings. Burma had jungles, monsoon conditions, and brutal distances. Wherever roads failed and water interrupted movement, the same basic question returned. Can the army keep moving? Not can it fight, in the abstract. Can it move here, now, with what it has? The bridge answered that question by being repeatable. Its genius was not that it solved one perfect engineering problem. Its genius was that it solved many imperfect ones well enough, fast enough, and often close enough to the front to matter. That idea shaped later thinking. Modern military engineering still lives with the same pressures: restore routes, cross gaps, support heavy vehicles, reduce delay, protect traffic, keep the force moving. The equipment has changed. The vehicles have changed. The threats have changed. But the principle remains almost painfully familiar. A formation that cannot cross cannot exploit. A force that cannot repair its route becomes predictable. A commander who ignores engineering eventually discovers that the battlefield does not care about ambition. There is also a civilian afterlife to the idea. Bailey-type bridges and similar modular systems have been used after disasters, floods, and infrastructure failures. The wartime logic, transportable parts, rapid assembly, adaptable spans, proved useful wherever people needed a bridge quickly and did not have the luxury of waiting for permanent construction. But in the documentary memory of war, the bridge still occupies an odd place. It is both famous and overlooked. Many have heard the name. Fewer imagine the pressure of its assembly. Fewer still think about the individual parts, the pins, the panels, the beams, the decking, the rollers, the men checking every connection while the road behind them filled with waiting vehicles. The legacy is not only technical. It is moral, in a restrained sense. The Bailey Bridge reminds us that war is not won only by the men who fire weapons. It is also shaped by those who make movement possible, those who repair what others destroy, those who solve practical problems while history looks elsewhere. The old belief was that decisive war belonged to striking power. What really happened was that striking power depended on continuity. Roads that remained open. Bridges that could be replaced. Supply that could reach forward. Wounded men who could move back. Armored columns that did not stall at every broken span. The tiny bridge part, the pin, stands for this larger truth. It is not romantic. It is not invincible. It does not make war clean. But it shows how much of war depends on the unnoticed. A pin in place means a panel holds. A panel holding means a bridge stands. A bridge standing means a tank crosses. A tank crossing means an infantry unit may not be left alone. An infantry unit supported means an attack may continue. A continued attack means the enemy has less time. Less time can change a battle. And sometimes, a changed battle changes the lives of men who never know the name of the object that helped carry them forward. So the question at the end is not whether the tank mattered. It did. The question is what carried the tank to the place where it could matter. For that, we return one last time to the riverbank. What really carried the tanks forward? By dawn, the river is no longer black. It is gray now, flat and cold under a washed-out sky. Smoke drifts along the bank in torn layers. The mud has been churned into something almost liquid by boots, wheels, and shell bursts. Men move more slowly than they did in the night, not because the danger has passed, but because exhaustion has reached the bone. The bridge is there. Steel panels. Decking. Ramps. Pins driven through joints that resisted in darkness. A structure made in pieces, assembled under pressure, now stretching across the obstacle that had stopped the advance. The first tank moves. Slowly. Its tracks bite the ramp and climb. The bridge takes the weight. Men watch without looking as if they are watching. Some pretend to check tools. Some light cigarettes with hands that do not quite steady. The tank rolls forward, heavy and deliberate, and the bridge gives it small sounds beneath it, creaks, knocks, the dull pressure of weight transferring through steel. Halfway across, time seems to narrow. Then the tank reaches the far side. No one cheers wildly. That is not the mood. There may be a shout, a gesture, a quick wave forward. Mostly there is motion. The second vehicle begins to move. Then another. The column starts to breathe again. What had been a traffic jam becomes an advance. What had been a gap becomes a route. What had been a few men in mud becomes, on the map, a clean arrow across a river. This is how much of war disappears. The machine crosses, and memory follows the machine. But the bridge remains under it. And inside that bridge are the small parts no one sees from a distance. The pin the sapper wiped clean. The joint forced into line. The hammer blows in darkness. The men who return to the work after shell bursts. The officer who refused to clear the crossing before it was ready. The driver who trusted the structure with his crew's lives. They believed armored advances were carried by engines, guns, and steel armor. But what really happened was quieter. Sometimes the advance moved only because a tired engineer, under fire, forced one small bridge pin into place. That does not diminish the tank crews. It does not diminish the infantry. It does not diminish the artillery, the drivers, the medics, the signalers, or the men who fought on the far bank waiting for support. It connects them. War is often remembered through its most visible machines. The tank in the street. The bomber over the target. The ship at sea. But underneath those images are thousands of smaller dependencies, each one plain, physical, and unforgiving. A bridge must hold. A part must fit. A man must keep working when every instinct tells him to get down and stay down. The sapper at the riverbank did not stop to think of legacy. He was not shaping a metaphor. He was cold. He was tired. He wanted the pin to go through. He wanted the bridge to hold. He wanted the tanks to cross and the shelling to stop. That is enough. In the end, the story of the tiny bridge part is not a story about a miracle object. It is a story about scale. About how the largest movements in war can depend on the smallest points of contact. About how belief gives way to mud, steel, weight, and time. About how the battlefield has a way of stripping away every grand assumption until only reality remains. They believed the obstacle was the river. But what really happened was that the obstacle was every inch between intention and crossing. And on some mornings in World War II, history did not move because a general ordered it forward. It moved because a bridge held. And because the hands that built it did not let go. Final CTA. If you watched this story from beginning to end, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. If someone in your family served during the war, as a soldier, engineer, mechanic, nurse, driver, factory worker, or in any role history too often leaves unnamed, you are welcome to share their story below. And if you want more forgotten World War II stories told through the people, decisions, and small details that changed what happened on the battlefield, subscribe to WW2 Combat Files. What they believed. What really happened.